This week, if you can hear me out there in the blogosphere, the YouTube nation, we're talking about cultures and customs and all good things to bring our gaming world to life. And if you are a consummate subscriber and consumer of this channel, and I hope you are. We did a week where we talked about festivals and holidays and celebrations. So this is a bit of a bookend to that discussion. Now, the format of this show, for those who don't know, is that generally Monday through Friday for an hour live, we talk about one subject and then we subdivide it in 5 ways. So today's Monster Monday, and then of course the other days of the week have their own schedules. Okay, thank you. Yeah, there it does seem to be a bit of a delay when it comes to YouTube, and there is some hesitation. So my suggestion is to look away. Please look away. The man on the screen is not who you think it is. No, there is some hesitation. There will be some corrections for my lag. There's a problem on my end through my provider, but hopefully my audio is coming across really well. And for those who are listening on YouTube, if you prefer not to use that or it's causing a lot of bandwidth or something, thanks, P. There is you can also tune in live and join the Fantasy Grounds College Discord server. And if you join Fantasy Grounds College, you can you get over there in the Discord and you can check out the administrators and the classmates and collegiates all up at the top with all of their lessons and classes. But if you want to hang around with the cool kids, slide down to the boiler room, and that's where the rest of us are hanging out. So you maybe throw a towel over over the screen or something, or put your phone in your pocket or whatnot. All right, let's get down deep. All right, Mr. Spenzar, thank you very much. Audio's Chris, thank you. And Plora, thank you very much for the sarcastic compliment. I love it. Now, this was spawned by Mr. Spenzar, and I think this is a great way to. It's one of our excellent tools we can use when designing our tabletop RPG games, and strangely enough, it is also one that incorporates a lot of chaos to it. And for those new DMs and GMs out there, chaos can be a little bit disconcerting, but I'm here to tell you that tabletop RPGs are all about chaos. Thanks, Palora. You're very kind. So, what do I mean with the chaos? All right. So we're going to talk about customs and cultures and things of that nature. And I thought we would break them down into some reasonable manners in which you can bring your world to life and your interactions to life. Now, mind you, this is not limited to sentient creatures. I'm including animalistic, bestial creatures in here as well, in the sense that they do have behaviors and instincts, and I'm going to relate those as well and incorporate them because we don't want to leave them out, and we don't necessarily need to make that a whole week of talking about animal behavior. So, what are some things, some touchstones that we can use, some things that can elicit reactions? Well, what the main thing, and I'm sure Mr. Spenzar is going to agree with this, and the rest of you guys who are hanging out, is that when one of the greatest things to have in your game is to introduce an element for your players that they bump up against, and it elicits a question in their mind, a desire to interact, a desire to investigate, it, a scratching of the head and going, I wonder why, and then just fill in the blank, right? Why are they, how come it, that's a strange, and if your players are drawn towards these things, that's the kind of thing, yep, Mr. Spenzar makes a T-shirt. It says, "quote baiting the plot hook." Exactly, and the reason for me mentioning chaos is because you, as a creator, may not even understand what it is that you are incorporating into your game in the first place? You might not have an answer. So let's break down some of these customs and cultures and such. Okay. Now we have a veritable infinite resource when it comes to examples of customs and cultures because we have our entire world. Now, before anyone gets triggered by the idea of taking someone else's culture and using it at your gaming table, first of all, there are no gaming table police. No one's going to be knocking on your door if you misappropriate or misuse someone else's culture at your table with your players. All right, but you also might be want to be sensitive to others who are there as well. So here's an idea: you don't take the entire culture and then just reskin it, although you can do that. But what you want to do is you want to take little bits and pieces. For example, I used for today's Monster Monday, I used a thumbnail. And on that thumbnail, there is a hyper focused picture of a woman. I believe she might be Indian, possibly. I'm uncertain, but I know her hands. She's wearing a colorful garb. You don't see her face. And her fingers are painted in very elaborate henna tattoos, or I'm assuming they're painted in henna tattoos, right? And the question is, why? And so when you incorporate these things into your world, you can have someone behaving in a certain manner, speaking in a certain manner, eating, greeting people in a certain manner, wearing certain types of clothing, etc., etc. And the question will be why? All right, so how do we subdivide some of these customs and cultures in our world and have them make sense? Basically, like a checklist. Okay, so a few things on my checklist would be food. What do people eat? Do they live? Are they a coastal town? Do they eat shellfish or do they fish in general? Do they? What kind of vegetables do they eat? Maybe some pick something different. Like instead of potatoes, pick something a little bit separated from that, but the same along the same lines, like a radish or a sweet potato or a yam or something. Do they are they primarily beef or chicken eaters? Fowl. We've got pork. We have other animals that we can eat, and it could be their normal staple. Goat, snake, camel, you know, boar, something like that. Do they hunt and are they hunter gatherer type people, even if they live in a big city, which might be kind of strange? Do they farm? For their livestock and or vegetables, and if so, why? Many of our grains are a very common staple from depending on which region of our world you live in, and you could just substitute that into your tabletop role-playing game. Is it wheat, rice, corn, maize, things of that nature? So, what do they eat? You know, and then when you attach to what do they eat, especially separating maybe social status. For example, what do the rich and privileged people of your world eat versus the poorer working class people eat? Yeah, Pelor says, oh, Mr. Spencer puts in a link into the Discord in Fantasy Grounds College about traditional monsters. From daily infographic monsters around the world. I like that because, as we know, even in classic Dungeons and Dragons, a lot of those monster manuals were created from monsters from around the world, and with them come their own histories and such. And that's a great thing to pull from as well. Pelor says you can go about it with sensitivity quite happily as far as pulling cultures and traditions. I'm presuming. I don't know why anyone would get precious about using foreign cultures in their game. It's an opportunity to learn for me as a GM and makes things solid, consistent, and interesting for players. I cannot agree with you more because if you shorthand is a great tool for us game masters as well, right? And so it's far easier to say my elves or orcs have a very Japanese like culture than it is to have to describe where people wearing silk kimonos with elaborate floral designs on them and hey Vince, what's going on there, man? Or talking about them using curved swords that are made elaborately. Now you can describe these things, but it would be difficult to describe them and then at the same time go, well, it's like Japanese culture, but it isn't. Well, honestly, it is. Right? If you're gonna pull the some of the language and behavior and weapons and you know, clothing and their tea ceremonies and classic, right? Yep, or kimonos with like bloody battlefields on them or something. But yeah, Pelora says inspired by real life events. Yeah, yeah, it's like it's very shorthand, and why not make something shorthand, okay? And it's not a matter of us going in a strange way. It's not a matter of us appropriating or disrespecting another culture. It's more like I like that culture. I want to use it, which in a way is really our first desire, right? Oh man, I've wanted to use, it, Egypt in my game for so long. Now's my opportunity. Okay, the PCs, you end up on a distant shore and people approach you and they're wearing, golden wraps around their bodies and sarongs and such, and they're carrying a staff, and the staff has a big jackal's head on it or whatever, those kind of things, right? Even if depends on like orcs are Mongolian, not Japanese. All right, Mister Well, actually, but in all seriousness, right? You can subdivide your own cultures down as well. So, and depending on how civilized or bestial or nomadic or sedentary you want to make your culture, uh, the differences between, say, Mongolian culture and Japanese culture might be like day and night to them. And actually, in my mind, I'm thinking it's the exact same difference in my head. Mr. Spenzar says the orcs have an incredibly serious and practiced tradition of making weapons. They take the bones of great beasts they slay and burn their bones in the flames. They force their iron in, unknowingly adding carbon to the mix and making steel. I love that stuff. Yeah, dude, I knew. Listen, I knew you were going to believe you me. I was like, oh, I'm going to need a co-host for this one. So I knew you'd pop in some flavor there, man. I love it. And the using our real world cultures, even if you want to change them up a little bit, you want to make your orcs Japanese like versus the Elven Mongolian styled cultures, and maybe the orc Japanese live in these tall, towering monoliths, and you're like, well, that's not in Japan. Well, maybe they are. Vincent said dwarfs are Russian and gnomes are Swiss. And you can have a lot of fun with that too, as far as like, the classic dwarves are Scottish or Irish or something. We could dispel that belief as in terms of cultures and such as well. So Pelora says, I've learned more about history of foreign cultures doing prep than I did in history class. I slow slow clap on that one. I can't tell you how much stuff, how many rabbit holes I've dived down doing a little Google searches and trying to find things for games and just being amazed. There's I'm squirreling this, but there's sometimes it's just amazing to find things and find out that it's amazing that a certain culture did something, or they created something, or something existed for a long time, or this particular culture used some mineral or element or animal byproduct or whatever, or engaged in some elaborate rituals, and you're like, really, they did that? And so I'm with you, Pelora. I've learned more about foreign cultures just doing game prep than history class, and it's incredible. She goes on to say it doesn't get taught, though. Then you have to come to the realization that the British are bastards. Yeah. Oh man. Yeah. It's also there's the idea of embracing the good and the bad. So it's not trying to look at cultures from the idea that one culture is the hero and the other culture is the villain. It's just accepting that history itself is what it is, and accept that every culture every culture is a hero amongst their own eyes and the villain of someone else's story, or the villain of their own story. So you know, it's the idea that when you're watching it, or you're on television or a movie, or you're reading about it, and you're trying to create a culture that is as realistic as possible, as immersive. And so that means that, from the outset, visitors might go, "Oh, I love this culture," until they find out that they are doing something that you find reprehensible. And within that culture, it may be quite normal. And I'm going to say, with a pretty much pretty much a guarantee, that every culture that's ever existed on our planet for any reason is made up of good and bad things that we would find based on your moral or ethical parameters of today. Yeah, Pelora says, I think everyone lives in some good or some bad. Yeah, Mr. Spenzar says British are bastards. They enforce the end of slavery upon their empire, but continue to exploit the resources. Some good, some bad. Yes. We here in the states, we've got some good and some bad, and a dollop, quite a huge dollop of both, right? So, yeah, Pelora says you think. I think everyone lives in some good, some bad. You just get the "we're so good" narrative usually. Most no one ever points at themselves and says, "Nah, I'm not as good as those other people," right? No matter what it is. So the idea of using of having the good and bad could be a great storytelling point, especially if you're going upon what is the classic Star Trek: The Next Generation episode where they go to a planet of peace and prosperity, a literal paradise with no laws except one, and they have a small little garden. And if you destroy that, or walk into, or disrupt this one little garden, it's a death sentence. It's like, yeah, it's like that. It's like, oh, it's great to live here and be amongst the people, and yes, yes, but the only thing is you have to gather. When the sun comes up, we all gather together and just take 30 seconds to close our eyes and feel the sun against our skin. And you're like, that's it? That's the only rule? Yeah, that's it. Otherwise, you can just do whatever you want. Free food and clothing, and you're like, wow, this is great. And one day you oversleep, and they want to drag your ass out and throw you in, hang you from a tree or something. You're like, really? Yeah. Mr. Spencer says Benjamin Franklin, one of my local heroes, describes slavery as having a wolf by the collar. You can't hold on to it forever. You know it must be free, but also know it's going to bite you when you let go. Yeah, Benjamin. I have a personal problem and difference between the creators of the Constitution, in the sense that these people wrote a document talking about wanting to be free, having slaves at the time they did it, right? And for 400 years thereafter, continued to have slaves. So, yeah, I on my personal relationship to that is like when I hear people talk about, well, this country was created on Christian values and all this kind of stuff, and I'm like, yeah, with an asterisk, because it took you over 400 years to realize that maybe we shouldn't be employing human forced human labor to keep us afloat. How So, again, the good and the bad, right? And of course you're going to have the self proponents are going to go, well, we were the heroes. I mean, nothing like that. Mr. Spencer says orcs having a storied history of warring with other races due to their strict codes of honor and the perceived slights against them. Yes, very much so. I could see that if you want to incorporate your orcs like as a Japanese typed culture. The dwarves and orcs have done away with their ancient grudges by means of mutual appreciation of their crafting prowess, and the dwarven discovery that the grudge that they went to war over has been turned into a intricate oral tradition about a venerated enemy by the orcs. And that's even history itself can come up with cultures and traditions and such because, for example, those who remember, say, the dwarven orc wars, or are born from that or remember the horrors of that are going to have one opinion, whereas the younger folk who come along, the ones who created the peace between them, the ones who work together, are going to have a different opinion of it, despite the fact that everyone understands what the history is, but they won't understand, or they look at the context in two different ways. We can relate that into our own world about Israel and all of the, Israel and Palestine, right? You have some people that are going on the outside going, stop fighting. And those on the inside, like, no, I'm not going to stop fighting because those people killed and harmed and tortured my people, and I'm not going to stop until I get my reparations, right? So you do have a lot of that, and over time those things will change and shift and all that kind of stuff. And I picked that's just one conflict that is creates some cultural differences and parity that you can really pull on when it comes to having our tabletop RPG great wars and such. Plur says, to be fair, did African history? I did some South African history with some British rolled in. I don't know much about U.S. even. I know all about the setting, invasion of South Africa, apartheid, and all that stuff because that's what I was taught. I knew next to nothing about Chinese, Persian, Irish history. Exactly, exactly. You could even claim you could use and mind you, we're being very generalized, right? So you could use, say, the uh, the surface level history of South Africa as a parallel to, say, this. I'm going to pull this in, your dwarven orcish history. So the orcs may have lived in the country beforehand and been invaded by the dwarves, or vice versa, and then over time there was an apartheid type of culture established by the invading ruling class, which was eventually brought down. And you're going to have people with different opinions, looking at each other in various ways. It would be even funny to have dwarven and orcish agents working together to create a war between the two because they understand that they don't like each other, which would be very funny to have agents working together of different cultures and races for the purpose of of having a conflict with each other. Deadman says, in all honesty, the U.S. was one of the first nations to abolish slavery, and there are still slaves in some Muslim countries today. Yes, and also there is the, well, how do you say this? There are, no, I'm not going to go down that path. I'm not going to do that. Yeah, some would argue. I'm going to be a little bit dark, but a little facetious with this, dead man. Some would say that there is, because of child slavery and the idea of an extensive criminal underground for human trafficking, that people would do that. Yeah, and I was gonna go into the, yeah, wage slavery, yeah, yeah, and those kind of things. Which okay, we're here to talk about tabletop RPG fuel. One person's paradise is somebody else's prison, right? So yeah, Monster Monday, yeah, we could do that kind of stuff. Now, all right, so let's subdivide some of these things. Let's make up some tools that we can use for our. Uh, let's use some tools. Hey, Rickard, what's going on? Use some tools to create some and cultures and customs for our NPCs and our creatures and such. So one thing I brought up was food. How, not just what do we eat, but how do we eat it? I bring up Let's bring up Luke Skywalker. Luke Skywalker on the planet of Hoth, getting stuck out there in the getting stuck out there in the frozen wasteland. Yes, I'm pivoting hard. Whatever. That sounded kind of dirty. Anyway, so Luke goes out there, goes to find some shelter or whatever the hell, and gets smacked in the head. Or he's on his tauntaun, he gets smacked in the head. Boom. And what happens? What do we see in the movie? Did the GM roll a crit and take my man out? No. Oh, Rickard, you're fine. Yeah. Catch me tomorrow. Hopefully, our internet will be much better because in a couple of hours, in hour and a half, it should be better. But anyway, so Luke wakes up with his feet frozen. This is a classic scene, frozen in the ceiling of the icy cavern, and closes his eyes and summons the lightsaber to him before the Wampa comes back to eat him. Right. Well, there were no words describing what was happening. We just understand that this is how this creature eats. It takes some of its victims, probably. I don't know how it thawed the ice. Maybe Luke's body heat got him stuck up there, or maybe the creature breathes on the ice to like get it melted a little bit. But we don't know. Much like a spider creating a spider web and encircling its prey in a web so that it can eat off of its prey slowly. How something eats is very important. Now, what about our sentient creatures, right? How do we eat? Luke was a typical teenager California hot rodder. Sure was. With his old beat up jalopy, right? It is how what what kind of traditions do we do when we consume a meal? And sometimes I can tell you a bit about those people. You could have your classic orcish barbarian. We're just murderous running through everything until maybe the PCs go to an orc camp and they find out that the when they have a kill, they make sure that the elderly and the young eat first, or those that are injured or something, or the matriarch, the queen, the hunters go out and slay some beast and bring it back, and then the matriarchs are the ones that divide up the food and resources or something of that nature. You don't know, and those are cultural things. So how do we eat? What do we eat? And who's invited to eat? Do you eat on the run? Are there elaborate methods to eating? Do you give thanks to the gods? Are the foods that they eat poisonous or dangerous to begin with? Are the foods are they of a rarity that they consume, or is it very common, much like a herd of animals? Or are there just like millions of these things that they just eat one at a time? Or is it something very rare and only a certain type of breeder animal? Are there things that they would never eat as well, even though it might be very common? Maybe there's a relationship towards with a divine being or an elder god or a powerful entity or patron or something, and so they do not consume or harm or invade the territory of a particular type of animal or something of that nature. Pelorus says offerings of food are a thing in apes. Not sure about other creatures. Penguins give gifts of nice rocks. Yep, they sure do. And there are many animals, surprisingly, that use tools. Beavers build dams. Birds use rocks to crack open shellfish and things of that nature. We know that plenty of marsupials use things like sticks and rocks and things like that to go after their food as well. Now, there's the classic bear going after the honeycomb inside of a bee's hive idea as well. Now, so those are for animalistic, and so we have ourselves food and food like traditions. So when PCs meet a go upon distant shores and they meet an alien culture to them, alien to themselves, and they are invited to a meal, or are they invited to a meal? What are the circumstances invited to the meal? Do they come unarmed? Does everyone wear their weapons? Do they clean themselves? Is it nothing more than just plop your ass down on a rock and start eating and dip your food in? Is it done family style where everyone feeds off the same giant plate, or is everyone given something different, et cetera, et cetera? Mr. Spencer says the hunters that brought the animals in from the hunt perform a dance-like ritual, retelling of the hunt while the children and elders are fed. I love that. I absolutely love that. And why not? Maybe that is a excellent way to communicate some ideas. And of course, what we want to do is not just immerse our players, but we want to drop hooks, story hooks. We want to drop seeds. What story are they telling? Maybe they start doing this dance that tells a story, and the PCs are like, maybe that's where the dungeon is located, right? Mr. Spencer goes on to say the party helps in a hunt and is suddenly expected to dance for the tribe, which would be kind of cool, right? Hey, my ranger and barbarian and rogue scout went and hunted down this creature. Great. Okay, now you're expected to dance and sing, and you're like, what? Go ahead and make those performance checks. The bard sitting back laughing with his hands behind his head, right? Like, oh, you wanted to go after and hunt this thing down. Time for you to perform. And of course, maybe a performance check isn't necessary. Maybe the whole idea is to engage in the act in the first place. So the tribes people might be laughing at them, but at the same time they're happy because they have embraced whatever this culture has done. Pelora says, I suppose even a simple level, the method of getting food is a part of the culture. Nomadic herds traveling around, foraging for berries, fungus farms. Ants do this, yes they do. Pack hunting, solo hunting, persistence hunting, hunting with traps, etc. Yes, absolutely. And even in a what we would consider a super modernized society, you may still have hunters or those who trade. We still in our major cities we still have to bring in food goods, perishable items, and so there you could even have a the culture of accepting those goods from an outside source to bring into your larger cities and such, and how they come about getting and arriving at those goods. So do that, like you said, Florida, using traps. Yeah, Plura says fantasy settings have magic food. Yeah, and they could be flavorfully magic. Maybe a certain meal that you eat turns your skin purple for a half hour or so, or you belch up bubbles, or the tone of your voice changes or something, or your eye color or something silly like that. Maybe maybe you get into a little bit of the belching and farting out gases or something that can be pretty silly. If you want to go that route, yeah, you could have some funny things. Maybe hair grows or whatever, or you have a certain scent that comes out of your pores. It could be awful, or it could be quite pleasant, as a matter of fact. The Mr. Spencer says the I'm not going to say that word. The I've been corrected on that. The Inuit of northern Canada could easily feed themselves and their family with a seal or two every few days. They came together to hunt whales so that the whole tribe could eat, also as a show of their prowess. And in a fantasy world, you have yourselves like purple worms. What are some giant things like purple worms, dragon turtles? Kraken might be too big, but why not? Naturally large animals, mastodons, elephants. Come on, give me some large fantasy creatures. There's some larger dinosaurs, brontosaurus size, and triceratops. What's the turtle-like one? Anyway, those creatures may themselves be, I can imagine an underground dwarven community hunting, uh, go, having a ritual before killing the purple worm and then having a ritual afterwards. Ground sloths, land sharks, yep, boulets. Ground sharks, yep. I mean, land sharks, sorry. Ground sloths and land sharks, yes. And of course, we can reskin the hell out of a bunch of these things as well. Yep, the dragon turtle, something big and large that would probably take a whole community to hunt it down, and having the skill to actually do it. So okay, so we have our food items, but let's get into some other cultures and customs. Now, previously in our conversation about festivals and holidays, these are Groot slangs. Yeah. Oh, that's thank you very much for that one. The the festival holiday thing we often talked about when it came to like the equinox or solstice or once a year or happens about a particular date. But we want things that happen far more commonly than that. These are our cultures and customs, and a lot of that. Pelor says, which annoys me because it's Afrikaans for big snake. Yeah, we have one of our books. We put in a Groot slang. If I know I'm butchering the pronunciation, but it's a multi-trunked, intelligent, sentient elephant that lives on the high plains, the Sierra, the savannas of the world and such. But anyway, I digress. Now, some of our cultures and customs can come from language. Yep, it's in the Plains book. Sure is. Thank you very much for that. The idea that how people communicate with each other. And this doesn't necessarily mean you absolutely positively need to learn another language. Not at all. As a matter of fact, you could do something very simple when it comes to pulling other languages. I'm going to take the example of the X-Men. Yes, I'm going to the X-Men comic book. In the X-Men comic book, the second generation of the X-Men comic book, I believe it was the late 70s or early 80s, and it incorporated Storm, Colossus, Nightcrawler, Wolverine, etc. Okay? What they did was, all they did is pull a couple of keywords. These are basically key phrases, words, slang, and such to identify each character as coming from the region that they did. Did the comic book writers know Russian for Colossus? No. But he called everybody comrade and tovarish. For Wolverine, he's Canadian, although he's kind of he morphed into more of an international character, but he was Canadian. So what did he say? He said a lot of cripes, Nightcrawler did a lot of uh, spoke a lot of German and mentioned mein Freund. I don't know how to pronounce it. But anyway, when you're reading the comic book, each character had an identifying greeting or gesture or term of endearment and used it. Mein Frau. Uh, he always said that to Kitty Pryde, Shadowcat, one of his teammates. And but along those lines, Thor saying something like maybe like "by the gods" or a particular character having a particular key phrase, you can stretch that out into a culture and have the people say a particular phrase or term of endearment or greeting or something like that. And you don't need to pick too many of these. As a matter of fact, I think three is probably a good thing. Like three foods, maybe three language terms, and to differentiate, say, five coastal cities by picking different languages, the PCs may understand where these people come from. Oh, you come from the north because you always talk about, you know, the frozen ice or something. Very common. Did I think very deeply about that? No, it just came off the top of my head. But we don't need to get as deep as we need to, especially if they meet a character who's in the desert region who's like, oh, by the cracked ice. And you're like, cracked ice? I don't think you guys have ever seen ice before. Where's this person from? And so on and so forth. Pelor says, I also used Irish Gaelic for songs. The nice thing about languages is that sometimes they drop out of common usage, but some people try and keep them alive. Absolutely. Welsh is there, but people in Wales almost all speak English as a first language. North Wales has some only Welsh speakers. And Welsh is just cheating at Scrabble as far as I'm concerned. I like that. But you are absolutely right. A language usage will drop in and out. As a matter of fact, American English is. We would probably lose a giant 30%, 50, 70% of our language. I'd say it's probably a good 30% if we eliminated the words that have been incorporated into the American English U.S. language from other cultures, right? We have boats, but we also have canoes. We have stores, and we also have bodegas. We have, boy, I'm coming. We have barbecues, but we also have hibachis. We have robes, but we also wear kimonos. There's it's like we have an umbrella, but there's also parasails. So depending on how language, and mind you, again, I pulled those off the top of my head. We also have a lot of different languages and things, and a great method. I don't know you guys have done this. I know you've done this before. You come up with a name of an NPC, but you type into the Google search, what is Dark Storm in Irish? What is Dark Storm in Afrikaans? What is Dark Storm in I don't know, a Brazilian or something? You know what I mean? Spanish or whatever. And so I know I've done that a million times. Take a couple of words. You want to translate certain locations in your world, like mountains and streams and rivers and lakes and forests and deserts, and translate them into another language. And so that's you can absolutely do that, especially pulling one or a few key phrases from other languages. And you could pick older languages, not necessarily used today. Latin is a very common one I like to pick from. I often relate Latin and Draconic together like a language of science and magic and such. And so that's what I've commonly how I think of those languages. Mr. Spencer says, in response to Sphinxes, certain intelligent monsters who are rarely challenged intellectually ask riddles, pose questions, or challenge the party to games to amuse themselves, with the obvious alternative being it attacking if they don't play along. And that very much could that is a that is very much a combination sentient custom and a bestial custom combination, because you don't often relate the idea of, oh, I'm going to have a conversation with you with riddles, and relate that to, I'm going to devour you by tearing your flesh from your bones, right? Yeah, and Deadman says translate.google.com is an excellent resource if you want a translation. So our example of using an Orcish community and having it Japanese, you can always translate it to that. Whereas maybe the neighboring Elven Mongolian styled culture, you could translate some of their common words and phrases and such. Yeah, Hippolor says my spells for my Chinese D&D character have spell translations in Mandarin. I love that. I love that. And of course, when it comes to language, there's also the cultural aspects of that language. So, for example, how interesting would it be for the player characters to say their language is written in a very Gaelic or Viking styled runes or glyphs on stones, but then they go to another culture, same rules of the game, same magic system, but instead they use ink and parchment, Japanese style, right? And they write going going in the opposite direction or straight down using parchment instead of it being engraved on stones or something. So you could very much, how people communicate, whether it's verbally or in a written form, change things around that way. Now, another way to add in some cultures as far as food and language are be clothing and behaviors, because we're getting towards the end here. I want to clothing, how people dress, why they dress a certain way, the colors they use, the how elaborate are the patterns that they use, and is the clothing related to a profession, gender, age, status in that particular culture, is all very important. We, in our own world, doctors wear lab coats, police officers wear a uniform, soldiers wear particular uniforms, firemen. I wear a uniform for my job. Lots of people wear specific uniforms. There are people who wear certain things because just by the nature of their job, not necessarily a uniform, much like construction workers of blue collar workers of all types that work in factories and such, right? So you have that idea. And then when you have normal everyday people. Do the men wear kilts and the PCs assume they're wearing skirts? You know, are sarongs and robes and large swaths of material wrapped around the human body and manipulated with clips and ties and knots? Do they wrap themselves in more of a tight clothing, almost mummified, where they wrap their arms and legs in very tight, manners? And is this important for their survival, or is this a an ancient cultural thing? A desert community, for example, many the people who live in desert regions may or may not wear their clothing to keep themselves cool and safe from the harsh sun and the desert winds. Whereas if they live in very modern cities, they may wear that clothing not to protect themselves, but because it's a cultural standpoint. So I could imagine a fishing village that no longer relies on fishing, but they wear a net as a cape or a skirt or a throw or wrapped around, like a half cape over their shoulder or something as a cultural touchstone to their origins as a sea dwelling people, even though they no longer use sailing ships or something like that. Mr. Spencer says regarding mercenary factions, you can use them as recurring NPC adversaries with a tradition of picking the strongest of their enemies and sparring with them, asking if they'd like to live on, joining a mercenary company in some capacity. The Isaac Arthur, a very large YouTube channel and does lots of science fiction, brought up the idea of future sports and says that the history of sports and competition itself came from work. So lots of sports that we have today, and I bring up sports because sparring with your enemy in itself is a sport related to a particular type of activity, which is war, which is survival. And so sand pits where people practice wrestling and swordsmanship, mercenary groups trying to find the best and brightest and most skilled warriors to bring in their mercenary groups. The idea of how far can you throw your spear because you may be recruited in or invited to join a hunting party. The training of dogs to help in the hunting party, and how skilled are you at training multiple dogs to perform different actions for you while you're going across the snowy tundra or something of that nature. So having incorporating air quotes combat into non-lethal cultures and customs is extremely common. That's where we get a lot of our sports today, from traditional football to American football and baseball and NASCAR and parachuting and all these other kind of things. Yeah, it's us wanting to embrace and overcome our natural society. And how do we measure our skills without really killing each other? Well, or reducing the incidences of us killing each other for fear of essentially wasting. The greatest warrior lives, the second greatest warrior just got killed, so that sucks. So having a way to measure our prowess against each other is super common. And why not? Uh, Pelora says in a clothing with more flowing in a culture, excuse me, with more flowing clothing, chefs could wrap themselves in bandage-like strips while they're cooking. When they're finished, they keep the wrappings and use them as fuel for the fire the next day. I am going to give you a, and I'm sure at least one of you out there knows this. Have you ever seen the samurai wearing their wakizashi and katana, and attached to the katana is a long braided string? I was taught, I never got the hang of it. I was taught what the purpose of that string is, and I know at least one of you out there knows why. The long baggy sleeves of the traditional samurai would get in the way when they would start using their sword. So that string was removed, and the string, one end of the string was held in the mouth, and the string was wrapped around their arms, over their shoulders, and around the other arm, and tucked in, and it would tie the sleeves of their, I don't know the name of that particular outer garment of the robe. It would tie the the sleeves of the robe, and it would draw the sleeves up to their shoulders and upper arms, leaving their arms free, and that's what that string was used for. Yep, little slight thing there. Yes, I love that. I love the idea of the the multiple use bandage like strips for chefs in this culture that wears flowing clothing, and and of course, no meal tastes good unless the wrappings from the day before are used, right? So Mr. Spencer says the party pillaged some clothes and armor off dead elves they come by. Of course they do. That's a D&D staple. We killed them. I'm going to take their stuff, right? Mr. Spencer goes on to say, not knowing that the clothes they've donned are those of executioners. When the players who put them on tries to talk to people in town, they begin to weep, falling to their knees and moving their hair out of the way, exposing their neck. I love that. And of course, the clothing doesn't need to be black, right? White is the color of death, if I'm not mistaken, for Japanese culture. So who's to say that the clothing that they pull from the dead elves isn't for that, right? It's called a sagio. Yes, the samurai sword. Yep, sure is. It is a long. It's a long, thin, braided string that you'll see where you'll see samurai carrying the sword, and you'll see the string kind of dangling, and such. And it's tucked into the sash, right? But you're like, well, what's it for? And I never knew what it was for until one of my martial arts instructors showed it to me. Who's actually pretty good at doing that, but I couldn't. You're supposed to be able to do it with one hand, to get your arm sleeves tied back with one hand, and it's very difficult. Yeah, the Reaper's judgment is absolute. Bonus fun when the elves discover it's not an executioner and they seek retribution. Yeah, why are you wearing the clothes of an executioner? And the excuse that we looted dead bodies and decided to throw some clothes on might not be appropriate. And, yeah, and PSDJ was sparring, not sparring. I'd imagine they consider fighting their opponents to be sparring. You're so sparring, not sparring. Well, it is sparring, although sparring might turn into sparring, right? Yeah, verbal sparring versus physical sparring. Yeah, Pelora says, thank you, Dead Man, for that with the Sagia. Pelora says, I must say, I don't give clothing as much thought as this usually. I usually just go with the style and make it more simple or fancy depending on the general status. You are very correct. But, well, I think we often think of not just the culture it belongs to, but, and like you're saying with status, but a lot of the clothing, of course, has to do with utility. For foremost, can would you wear this? Would you wear heavy armor in a island sailing culture? Probably not. You'd probably wear something that's formed from, or maybe floats or something, or easily survives moist regions. Whereas in a desert, you're going to wear something different. But the status of the clothing might be very important, especially like Mr. Spenzar went down in dark. Like, is it, are you an executioner, a doctor, some kind of alchemist or herbalist or apothecary? Are you an instructor of some sort? Are you a is there a difference between being a hunter and a gatherer in the kind of clothing that you wear? Such. Yeah. I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. Thank you, Mr. Spenzar, for that. Tesla Ranger says, Tasuki, or sash, a sort of sash that is used to hold up the sleeves of a kimono. And how interesting would it be for maybe a culture to have highly design an elaborate utilitarian clothing, meaning like you're thinking that they're dressed in fine, elaborate clothes, but each portion of their clothes allows them to perform different functions in their community. Hey, my sash allows me to tie my sleeves back. My headband, when wrapped around my hand, allows me to handle spiky fruits or something or such. Hey, baby, you too. Love you. Love you. The Heraldrix has called it in to this live stream as she heads off to work and such. Yes, Spencer says so. Yes, white is the color of death. Yes, exactly. And of course we'll bring this up in because I like to talk about necromancy and the dumb fight between is necromancy good or evil. Well, it all depends. But we'll talk about that as well. Death rights and such. We'll probably bring that up in world building, but maybe. Oh yeah, the House of Flying Daggers. Oh, what an excellent movie. And more complicated than it needed to be, but I love it. Man, they wore a lot of bright green. They sure did. A lot of, I dare to say, a lot of jade, wasn't it? Like a lot of bright greens and emeralds, lime greens and stuff. Man, it was a lot of bright green in that movie, and it did stay away from darkness and deep shadows. Another movie related to color with would be Hero with Jet Li. Oh my goodness, that the cinematography in that thing is great. It is woe for whom the Heraldrix tolls, weal or woe. Now, I know I'm going a little late, but okay. The last thing I'm going to say is behavior. We can and mind you, it's not limited to this. We want to create your own customs and cultures. Behavior. We danced around this, but behavior is an excellent tool. How do people act in the normal course of their lives, right? You brought up the idea of someone wearing clothing, and they thought of them as an executioner, and they dropped down to their knees weeping, right? So how do people act and react? I bring up handshaking versus bowing to someone when they greet them. Do they cross their chest when something terrible happens, when someone sneezes and you hear them say, God bless you? What is the purpose of that? Now, I mean, I know what the purpose is, but my point being is that people can act and react to things very commonly in your cultures and customs that might throw some PCs off. For example, the people that walk into a building and rub the stomach of the Buddha, or they form a circle with their fingers and look up at the sky when waking in the morning, or when they pass each other. Do the women walk in front of the men as they walk down the street? Do people gather in groups of three but never in groups of four? You know, is are there certain colors that seem to be absent? Talking about the bright green, is green just a color of luck? How seriously do people take their own traditions? Much as kids, I know here, and it's probably something around the world where kids have a thing like it's bad luck if you walk up if you crack a mirror, step on a crack, or walk under a ladder, right? It's bad luck to have a building with the floor, the number 13 or the number 666. Okay, yep. Tesla says my German grandmother made sure there were never 13 seated at the table. Exactly. And then how seriously do they take it? And I'm not making fun of this at all, Tesla. So please don't take this personal. But does grandmother take this serious? But the kids are like, whatever. I mean, she wants it that way, but it's not. That's just a wise tale, right? Or does grandmother, slam her very intricately carved walking stick down on the floor and make everyone shut up, and she forces everyone to bring yet one more seat to the table, a 14th seat, and invite the stranger that's walking outside, one of the PCs, in to eat a meal to keep them from having 13 people at the table, while the rest of the family is like, why is this stranger sitting here? The kids are like, why do we have a stranger in our house? But the other family members are putting their heads down because grandmother spoke, and you do what she says. It's it that in itself could be a thing. Maybe in this culture, children or the elderly or the injured, maybe from wartime, are honored above all. Someone comes in with a an eye patch, or they're missing a leg and they're using crutches, and everyone stops and bows their head as this person goes into the local tavern and such. Or maybe there's a little a lockbox where someone can drop coins into it, and every time someone passes by the old wizened warrior sitting on the curb, they drop a coin in, and if you don't drop a copper, you don't give this piece a little halfpence or something like that, everyone looks at you like you're crazy. It could be any number of things, of behaviors, and the stranger and simpler the better, because you as the creator might not even understand why they're doing it. Whereas long time ago, I did some videos, and one of my communications with someone by the name of Silasha had a culture where it was more of a festival, but you could turn this into a daily culture where people wore hats with elaborate things attached to them, and birds would fly down and pick up pieces for their nests. And so the wearing of feathers might be very important to these people. And so when an important business transaction is done, or before people eat, they pull feathers from their outfits or their pack or their pouch, and they stick them into a little tiny cup of sand, and leave the feathers there sitting on the table and such. Um, any number of things. Maybe there's a pile of stones in a small urn, and there's a take one, keep one kind of mentality where everyone has a stone in their pocket, and they take a stone and drop it in there, and they take another well-worn stone and they put it in their pocket and keep on walking. And no one PCs don't understand why they're doing that, but maybe you as the DM are like, I don't know why, I don't know, but maybe the PC start questioning it. And if you got a good group of players, they're going to talk out loud, and they're going to make up a reason. They're going to presuppose a reason for why they're acting this way, and that's where you as a game master steal it. And you go, that makes a lot of sense. I didn't think about that. Erase, delete, 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 type in new reason, That's exactly what you do. Mr. Spencer says dwarves see it as bad luck to leave a dead warrior unburied. Wars end with both sides silently digging each man a grave. All souls return to the earth. Exactly. I love the idea. Like you said, the dwarves return to the earth, and I will bring up, although this does have to do with traditions and holidays and such, but I'm going to read these last few comments, and end it with something a little somber, but related to embracing the hope that there is humanity. Pillar says, yes, that's it exactly. My motto when I have no idea. That's definitely a T-shirt, right? Yes, that's it exactly. I can't believe you guessed it, right? And you're sitting there like, mentally wiping your brow, like, whew, because I had no idea why I put that in there. Mr. Spenzar says numerical superstitions are a good one. They sure are. 13, 666, the number 7, and there's plenty of, for me in the states, Far East Asian numerology, and I guarantee you can look up numerology for anything from like tarot to astrology, and pull things from that, and other what what we first world countries would consider esoterica. Clothing denoting cultural position. Yep. Are you an oracle, an apothecary, an instructor, a warrior of some sort? Maybe there are different types of such as warrior classes, such as hunter, enforcer, warden, sheriff, bodyguard, those kind of things. Mr. Spencer goes on to say practices that synergize with the local fauna. The local flora and fauna, meaning like, do people act and or reenact, say, the acts of hunting cats and felines and tigers and such? Do they Do they raise and cherish dogs, wild dogs and wolves or something? Maybe they haven't done any of that. Maybe they haven't yet domesticated a certain type of animal. They've gotten close, but not quite domesticated it, just domesticated them. So instead of trained dogs or wild wolves, there's some synergy with them, and so they leave food items out for them, or they've made musical instruments that mimic the certain sounds of certain animals. There are people, you can see videos of people who are able to sing and yell to draw in cows and pigs and stuff from large fields, and the sound of their voice draws them in. Now, of course, they could have been trained to, oh, every time I hear this voice, we get fed. But there are videos of people who stand out in fields, and they do these high pitched, almost hypnotic sounds and intonations that draw cows from their fields and draw them in. Mr. Spencer goes on to continue to say religious traditions remaining in a society long after the gods have faded from prominence, keeping the flickering flame of its divinity alive. Party members saying, yeah, for example, the God bless you, the after the gods have faded, the idea that a thunderstorm represents Zeus or something or whatever, all those things. So anyway, guys, thank you very much. Let me go back in the chat. All right. Thank you very much for joining me in this endeavor. We will be talking about cultures and traditions and customs, but let me end this with this story that happened during World War One. And during World War One, I believe it was the German and American sides of war were in their they were deep in their trenches, and each day by day, ticking ever closer to Christmas, they were fighting each other. Young soldiers, 16, 17, 18 years old, frontline fighters. Yes, people lied about their age to join in war fronts. Many of them were drafted to fight, and these no man's lands were littered with the dead. And anyone we learned, we had, stealing from hardcore history, humanity learned how to take a punch, whereas wars were fought very quickly, sometimes in hours, if not days. Now we were taking weeks, months, and years to fight a war, and so the body count just rose. But on this one day, on Christmas, anyone who stuck their head up in one of those deep trenches would be killed by machine gun fire. They couldn't make their way across no man's land for all the landmines and explosives and mortar shells and crossfire and barbed wire and boiling pits of oil and death and destruction. But someone somewhere, while they're hunched down, began singing, and the singing grew, and other people grew. And what did they have related? It was the idea of celebrating Christmas. Now, I understand that this is more holiday and festival and celebration more than a custom, but the exchanging of gifts and the idea that there should be peace on that day was something that crossed the language barrier amongst these people. And this was the day when both sides of the enemy forces came out of their trenches, came together, walking across no man's land to shake hands, to embrace, to give each other small items of goodness, whether it was a cigarette or a piece of chocolate or what have you, to actually play football and all these kind of things. You guys, oh, you're so bad. I see you, Mr. Spence, and so this was a thing that was the leadership was absolutely positively livid with each other that their own forces would do this, because guess what? When you start to empathize with your enemy, that might prevent them from killing each other. Unfortunately, training and the leadership, the better part of valor, got them back in their trenches, and the war started again. But that was a moment that happened in history, and where a culture that spread, a custom that spread across language barriers, combined together to bring people who are murdering each other to shake hands and to embrace at least for one day. Marinades, you're so silly, Mr. Spence. Marrow grenades. That's pretty nasty. All right, guys.